A UN peacekeeping mission is an operation that has been sanctioned by the UN, usually the UN Security Council, to implement a peace treaty in a particular country or a ceasefire agreement in a particular country. Sometimes that is demobilizing those who've been fighting, reintegrating them into society. Sometimes it is to separate warring parties that are still more or less in conflict. And the UN peacekeepers are there to protect essentially civilians from being swept up in the conflict or being the focus of the war and being used to as sort of instruments of each side. These peacekeeping forces, they vary in size and mission all over the world, and they by and large are indispensable in trying to ensure that an agreement that has been reached to cease fighting is implemented in a sustainable way. The UN peacekeeping missions are called blue helmets because they wear blue helmets and they have a UN on them, and it's a way to show that they are not parties to the conflict, and it's to distinguish them to ensure they don't get shot at or swept up in the conflict. And it's a way to show that they are sort of neutral participants in the implementation of the ceasefire, not only for the combatants, but also for civilians too. If they need to seek protection, they can identify the UN as being the source of safe haven and so on. So a variety of countries contribute to UN peacekeeping operations. Incidentally, very few, if any, come from the P5, the Permanent Security Council members. They're mostly contributed from places like India, Bangladesh, Canada, Ireland, countries that are often seen as relatively neutral in world affairs. Every continent, there are countries that contribute in some way, and if they don't provide actual peacekeeping forces, they will provide the financial resources to maintain them. And this is where the United States plays a particularly important role as the single largest contributor to UN peacekeeping operations. Peacekeeping forces typically don't involve themselves in forcibly imposing order and peace in their area of operations. In a few rare examples, I think in Africa, there's been a couple of missions in which the UN peacekeeping force has been given the mandate, the authorization to use force in a more extensive way to bring about peace in the area, to prevent threats to civilians in particular from emerging. But very, very rarely will they actually involve themselves in any kind of fighting. The record of peacekeeping missions, I would say, is mixed. Some have, I think, kept the peace. You know, you look at the UN armistice agreements in Korea. I think that's generally been successful. Some would say it had to do with other factors. In other cases, the UN presence maybe plays a marginal role. Some people point to, say, the force in southern Lebanon. You know, it's there, it's monitoring a so-called ceasefire, but there's a war going on around it. And so it, you know, has arguably had limited success. So I think it varies. There are missions in Africa, for instance, that I think people have been considered a success, but others a failure. It really comes down to the support they get from the major powers, the level of funding, the mandate, and the quality of the forces. The future of peacekeeping, I think, quite frankly, is uncertain. Much hinges on the level of conflict or cooperation between the major powers. Without that support and commitment to the UN, it's very hard to believe that the UN can function and field peacekeeping missions that are effective. There are occasions when the stars aligned, if you will, where the great powers will believe that the UN can play a role, but unless that kind of confluence of interests exists, it's very hard for the UN to do its job. And so we're in a moment, I think, where there is considerable uncertainty about where the world is going in terms of the level of antagonism and friction amongst the major powers. And if we see their relations deteriorating further, and worse still, actually fighting one another in various places, whether it's Taiwan or Europe or elsewhere, then it's hard to imagine that the UN will frankly survive and UN peacekeeping missions will survive as a result.